6 secretaries in 1 month. They quit crying, bleeding, or simply vanished into the freezing Chicago winter. Lorenzo Rossi didn't run a charity. He ran the most ruthless syndicate in the city from a glass-paneled penthouse. Enter Chloe. She didn't possess a steel spine, lethal skills, or a secret death wish. She had $50 in her checking account, a broken heel, and a terrible habit of dropping things. She was supposed to last an hour. Instead, she brought an empire to its knees. The 40th floor of the Rossi Corporation smelled of bleach and expensive espresso. Lorenzo Rossi preferred it that way. Bleach meant the mess was gone. Espresso meant people were awake. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, staring at the empty leather chair opposite him. The previous secretary, a woman with a resume boasting 10 years at a Fortune 500 company, had lasted exactly 4 days. She had walked in on Matteo, Lorenzo's lieutenant, cleaning a Beretta in the break room. She hadn't even waited for the elevator. She took the stairs all the way down. Lorenzo rubbed the bridge of his nose. He didn't have time for interviews. The docks were backed up, a shipment from Palermo was missing, and the union reps were getting brave. "Next one is here, boss," Matteo said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked amused. Matteo was rarely amused unless someone was bleeding. "Send him in. It's a her, and she looks like she crawled out of a dumpster." Chloe Bennett didn't crawl out of a dumpster, but she felt like she had. The L train had stalled, forcing her to walk 6 blocks in a sleet storm. Her umbrella had inverted. Her left heel had snapped, reducing her walk to a rhythmic limp. She was wearing a beige thrift store blazer that was 1 size too big, and her hands were numb. She limped into the cavernous office. It was too quiet. The carpet was thick enough to swallow sound. At the far end of the room sat a man who looked like he was carved out of the same dark stone as his desk. Dark hair brushed back, eyes like flint, a tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent for the year. "Sit," Lorenzo said. His voice was low, scraping the bottom of the register. It wasn't a request. Chloe hurried forward. Her ankle rolled on the broken heel. She pitched forward, arms flailing. Her cheap faux leather tote bag slammed into the edge of the obsidian desk, bursting open. A barrage of items spilled across the pristine surface. A crushed granola bar, tampons, a handful of loose pennies, a heavily dog-eared copy of a tax code handbook, and a bright pink gel pen that rolled directly until it hit Lorenzo's clasped hands. Silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Chloe froze, her chest hovering inches from the desk. She slowly pushed herself upright, her face burning with a heat that reached her ears. "I am so sorry. The clasp is broken, the heel is broken, everything is currently broken." She scrambled to gather her miserable belongings, her fingers shaking. Lorenzo didn't move. He watched her. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely detached, like a scientist observing an insect. "Leave it," he said. She stopped, clutching a tampon and a penny. "You're late," he noted, glancing at a platinum watch. "The train stopped at Belmont. Someone pulled the emergency brake. I ran." She swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "Mr. Rossi, I need this job. I type 90 words a minute. I know Excel inside out. I don't ask questions." The last one didn't ask questions either. She just screamed. Chloe blinked. "Did you yell at her?" Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. No one interrupted him. No one questioned him. "No." "Then she lacked a strong constitution," Chloe said, stuffing the granola bar into her pocket. She looked down at the documents currently pinned beneath her spilled pens. It was an invoice. Upside down. She squinted. "Your math is wrong." The silence returned, colder this time. Matteo shifted his weight in the doorway, his hand casually dropping toward his jacket pocket. "Excuse me." Lorenzo leaned forward. The air in the room seemed to compress. Chloe tapped the thick paper with a trembling, pale finger. This invoice. Upside down. Column 4. The gross tonnage is listed at 4,500, but the multiplier for the shipping rate is calculated on 45,000. Someone added a zero. If you pay this, you're overpaying by $200,000. She withdrew her hand quickly, as if the paper had burned her. Lorenzo looked down at the sheet. He read the numbers. His jaw tightened, a small muscle ticking beneath the skin of his cheek. It wasn't a typo. It was a test from a supplier in Miami. They were seeing if he was paying attention. He looked back at the woman in the oversized blazer. She was terrified. She was practically vibrating with anxiety, but her eyes were sharp. "What's your name?" he asked. "Chloe." "Pick up your garbage, Chloe. Your desk is outside. You start now." Surviving the Rossi Corporation was an exercise in strategic blindness. By Wednesday, Chloe had established a few hard rules. Rule 1. Never open a box that didn't have a return address. Rule 2. If the men in the tailored suits came in, speaking rapid, hushed Italian, go to the break room and clean the coffee machine until they left. Rule 3. Do not look at the stains on the freight elevator floor. She was clumsy. It was a fact of her existence she had long accepted. Her spatial awareness was practically non-existent. On Monday afternoon, she had tripped over a rug and dumped an entire tray of ice water onto Matteo's lap. She expected to be fired. She expected to be hit. Instead, Matteo had stared at her in utter disbelief, while Lorenzo, sitting in his office, had let out a single, sharp sound. It took Chloe a full minute to realize the boss had laughed, but her clumsiness was physical. Her mind was a steel trap. It was Thursday evening. The office was mostly empty. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was the color of bruised iron. Chloe sat at her desk, the glow of the dual monitors illuminating her tired face. She was cross-referencing warehouse manifests against payroll. Lorenzo emerged from his office. He had discarded his jacket and tie hours ago. The top 2 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a faint scar near his collarbone. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that sat in the bones. He paused at her desk. "You're still here?" Chloe jumped, her knee slamming into the underside of her desk. She winced, rubbing her leg. "Just finishing the cross-check on the South Side warehouse, Mr. Rossi. Go home, Chloe. The numbers will be there tomorrow." "They will," she agreed, adjusting her glasses. "But the discrepancies won't be as easy to hide by tomorrow." Lorenzo stopped. The casual exhaustion vanished, replaced instantly by the predator. He stepped closer to her desk. "What discrepancies?" Chloe pulled up a spreadsheet. She pointed with her bright pink gel pen. "Warehouse 4. The payroll shows 30 men on shift for the past 2 weeks. But the supply requisition, gloves, masks, heavy machinery fuel, only accounts for 15. Someone is padding the payroll and pocketing the difference. Roughly 12 grand a week." Lorenzo stared at the screen. The numbers didn't lie. He knew exactly who ran Warehouse 4. A cousin of his mother's, a man who thought blood bought him immunity. "How long did it take you to find this?" Lorenzo asked quietly. 20 minutes. I got bored. The filing system you had before I got here was basically a trash can with tabs." Lorenzo looked at her. She was chewing on her lower lip, staring at the screen, oblivious to the fact that she had just signed a man's death warrant. She wasn't playing a game. She had no agenda. She simply liked order. In a world built on lies, shadows, and deceit, she was a terrifyingly pure beam of light. "Highlight it," Lorenzo said. Chloe uncapped her pen and drew a bright, obnoxious pink line across the printed ledger. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a teenager's homework. "Done," she said, capping the pen and dropping it. It rolled off the desk and under Lorenzo's leather shoe. She sighed, defeated by gravity once again. She knelt down, reaching for it. As her fingers brushed the carpet, she noticed a small black device attached to the underside of Lorenzo's desk, right near the rim. A small red light blinked in the shadows. She froze. Lorenzo looked down at her. "Did you get lost down there?" Chloe swallowed. She didn't know much about the Mafia, but she watched movies. She knew what a bug looked like. She stood up slowly, clutching the pink pen. She looked Lorenzo in the eye. "Mr. Rossi, I think you need to look at this spreadsheet, really closely." Her voice shook. She tapped the pen aggressively on the top of her desk, pointing her index finger straight down toward the floor. Lorenzo's eyes flicked to her finger, then to her face. He read the sheer panic in her eyes. He didn't ask questions, he didn't hesitate. He pulled a notepad toward him and wrote in block letters. "Where?" She wrote back. "Under your desk edge." Lorenzo's expression didn't change. He simply nodded. He reached out and gently took the pink pen from her trembling hand. "You did good work today, Chloe. Go home." Friday morning brought attention to the 40th floor that tasted like copper in the air. Costas arrived at 10 a.m. He was a supplier from the Greek syndicate, a mountain of a man with gold rings on thick fingers and a voice that rattled the glass partitions. He brought 4 men with him. They didn't wear suits. They wore leather and scowls, and they smelled of cheap cologne and stale smoke. Chloe sat at her desk, typing furiously. She was trying very hard to be invisible. Matteo stood by the door to Lorenzo's office, his hand resting on his belt. The underboss gave the Greeks a look of pure, unadulterated contempt before opening the heavy wooden doors to let them in. The doors shut. The silence was deafening. Chloe tried to focus on the monitor. She really did. But her mind kept drifting to the bug she had found last night. Lorenzo had dismantled it quietly, crushing it beneath his heel before making a phone call that consisted of 3 whispered words. Today, the office felt like a powder keg. 30 minutes passed. Then the shouting started. It was muffled, but the tone was undeniable. Costas was roaring. Lorenzo's voice cut through it, calm, cold, and utterly lethal. Chloe looked at her desk phone. No intercom buzz, no call for security. But she could hear the scraping of chairs, heavy footsteps. She looked down at the file sitting on her desk. It was the revised shipping contract for Costas. Lorenzo had asked her to bring it in at 10:30. It was 10:31. Her hands shook. Rule 1 of surviving: don't walk into a room where men are shouting. But Lorenzo had asked for the file, and she was a good secretary. She grabbed the file, stood up, and smoothed her cheap skirt. She picked up a tray holding a fresh carafe of coffee and 3 mugs. An olive branch, she reasoned. She pushed open the heavy doors with her back. The scene inside froze. Costas was standing, his massive hands planted on Lorenzo's obsidian desk, his face purple with rage. His 4 guards had their hands inside their jackets. Matteo had a gun drawn, pointed dead at Costas's chest. Lorenzo remained seated, perfectly still, his eyes dark and empty. Chloe stood in the doorway, a tray of coffee in one hand, a manila folder in the other. 10 pairs of eyes snapped to her. The tension was a physical wall, ready to collapse and crush everyone in the room. Chloe croaked. Her throat had closed up. "I brought the contract and coffee." Costas turned his massive head toward her. He bared his teeth. "Get out, little girl." Chloe stepped backward. Her heel, the one she had glued together on Monday night, finally gave out entirely. She went down. It wasn't a graceful fall. It was a spectacular, catastrophic collapse. The tray flipped. The carafe shattered against the corner of a leather sofa. Scalding coffee exploded across the expensive Persian rug. Mugs shattered like gunshots. The sudden violent noise caused one of Costas's men to flinch and pull his weapon. Matteo didn't hesitate. He shot the man in the shoulder. The room erupted. In a matter of seconds, Lorenzo was on his feet, a heavy revolver appearing in his hand as if by magic, pressed directly to Costas's forehead. Matteo disarmed a second guard, kicking him at the back of the knee to drop him to the floor. The remaining two Greeks froze, staring at the barrel of Lorenzo's gun. Chloe lay on the floor, covered in lukewarm coffee, a piece of porcelain resting in her hair. She clutched the manila folder to her chest like a shield. Silence descended again, broken only by the groaning of the shot guard. "Costas," Lorenzo whispered, his voice echoing in the large room. "You were saying something about disrespect." Costas swallowed hard. His eyes crossed slightly to look at the gun barrel. "Lorenzo, let's be reasonable. You came into my office. You raised your voice. And now—" Lorenzo didn't look away from Costas, but he tilted his head toward the floor. "You've upset my secretary." Chloe peeked open one eye. "Leave the contract, Costas," Lorenzo commanded. "Take your men. If I see you in Chicago before the snow melts, I will bury you under it." Costas slowly raised his hands. His men hauled the bleeding guard to his feet. They backed out of the room, leaving a trail of blood drops on the marble outside. The doors clicked shut. Lorenzo lowered the gun. He engaged the safety and placed it on the desk. He looked exhausted again. He walked around the desk and looked down at Chloe. She was still on her back. She looked up at him, her glasses askew. "Are you shot?" he asked, his voice entirely flat. "No," she squeaked. "Just caffeinated." Lorenzo reached down, offering a large, calloused hand. Chloe looked at it for a second before slipping her small, trembling hand into his. He pulled her to her feet, effortlessly. She looked at the ruin of the Persian rug. "I'll get the bleach." "Forget the rug," Lorenzo said. He took the manila folder from her rigid grip. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was a mess. She smelled like a French roast. She was a walking disaster, but she had walked into a room full of guns to deliver a piece of paper because he had asked her to. "Chloe," Lorenzo said softly. "Yes, Mr. Rossi?" "Take the rest of the day off, buy some new shoes, put it on the company card." He paused. "And Monday, try not to break anything." She nodded frantically, backing out of the room. As the door closed, Lorenzo looked down at the file she had brought. Sticking out from the top of the contract was a sticky note. Written in bright pink gel pen was a single line. "The Greek guy is lying about the shipping weights. Check page 4. Lorenzo pulled the sticky note off, staring at the messy handwriting. A slow, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. He folded the note and put it in his pocket. Maybe the new secretary would last a little longer than a week. Monday morning arrived with a brutal lake-effect wind that rattled the reinforced glass of the Rossi Corporation building. Chloe stepped off the elevator on the 40th floor at exactly 7:55 a.m. She was not wearing heels. She wore a pair of heavy, black, steel-toed combat boots. They were practical, they had thick rubber soles, and they were firmly laced. She had put them on the company card just as instructed. Matteo was standing by the reception desk, scrolling through a burner phone. He looked up, his eyes dropping to her footwear. A slow, genuine smirk broke through his usually stoic expression. "Going to war, Chloe?" he asked. "Going to the filing cabinet," she replied, unwinding a thick wool scarf from her neck. "I figured if I'm going to be dropping trays of coffee, I might as well protect my toes." Matteo chuckled, a low, rasping sound. It was the first time she had heard him make a noise that wasn't a threat. "The boss is inside. He left a stack of files on your desk. Don't spill anything on them. They're the real books." Chloe froze halfway through taking off her coat. The real books. In a legitimate business, the real books were just the books. In this building, the real books were a prison sentence bound in leather. She walked to her desk. There sat a stack of 4 thick black ledgers. No digital copies, no cloud backups, just ink and paper. She sat down, booted up her computer to run the dummy spreadsheets for appearance's sake, and opened the first ledger. For the next 8 hours, Chloe lived inside a labyrinth of shell companies, inflated real estate purchases, and ghost payrolls. It was brilliant. It was also deeply flawed. Lorenzo Rossi was a mastermind of strategy and fear, but his money launderers were getting lazy. They were repeating patterns. By 6 p.m., the office had cleared out. The winter sun had vanished hours ago, leaving the city in a glow of artificial orange light. Lorenzo stepped out of his office. He looked at the 3 sticky notes attached to the cover of the first ledger. "Explain," he said, tapping the notes. "Your front companies in the sanitation sector are routing money through a holding firm in Delaware," Chloe said, rubbing her tired eyes behind her glasses. "It works for small amounts, but last month they pushed $4 million through it. The IRS uses algorithmic flagging for sudden volume spikes in dormant LLCs. If they keep doing this, you'll trigger an automated audit by March." Lorenzo didn't blink. He absorbed the information instantly. "How do we fix it?" "Diversify the routing. You own 3 commercial laundries and a string of auto body shops. Run the cash through the physical, high-volume cash businesses. It eats into the profit margin because you have to pay taxes on the fake revenue. But paying a 30% tax rate is cheaper than paying a lawyer to keep you out of federal prison." Lorenzo stared at her. She was casually discussing federal tax evasion while peeling a clementine at her desk. She was entirely unbothered by the illegality of the conversation. She was only bothered by the inefficiency of the math. "Write up the routing structure," Lorenzo ordered. "Give it to Matteo tomorrow. Go home, Chloe." She packed her tote bag, a new one, canvas and zippered. She took the elevator down to the underground parking garage. The concrete cavern was freezing and smelled of exhaust and damp earth. Her steel-toed boots echoed loudly against the pavement. She reached her ancient Honda Civic. She fumbled for her keys, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Hey, you the new girl." Chloe jumped, dropping her keys. They clattered under the car. She spun around. A man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He was thick-necked, wearing a leather jacket that strained across his shoulders. He didn't look like Lorenzo or Matteo. He looked sloppy. He looked mean. "Carmine wants a word," the man said, closing the distance between them. Carmine was the cousin from Warehouse 4, the one whose payroll scam Chloe had highlighted in bright pink gel pen. "I don't know a Carmine," Chloe lied, her voice shaking slightly. She backed up against the cold metal of her car door. "Yeah, you do. You cost him a lot of money last week. He wants to know why a little secretary is looking at things she shouldn't." The man pulled a folding knife from his pocket. He didn't flick it open, but he held it loosely, letting the metal catch the dim, fluorescent light. "He says maybe you need to be taught how to look the other way." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She was entirely alone. The panic, sharp and cold, threatened to paralyze her. But then she looked at the man's feet. He was standing on a patch of slick, frozen motor oil. She didn't think. She acted on a lifetime of accidental destruction. Chloe grabbed her heavy canvas tote bag by the straps, swung it with all her might, and hurled it directly at his face. The heavy bag, loaded with 3 hardback romance novels, a heavy steel water bottle, and a backup battery bank, hit the man squarely in the nose. He shouted in surprise and pain, stumbling backward. His leather shoes hit the frozen oil. He slipped, his arms windmilling, and slammed hard onto the concrete floor. The knife skittered away into the darkness. Chloe didn't wait. She dropped to her knees, snatched her keys from under the Civic, unlocked the door, threw herself inside, and slammed the locks. She started the engine with a roar, threw it in reverse, and backed out without checking her mirrors. As she sped up the concrete ramp toward the exit, her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She answered it on the speaker, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. "Hello? Did you run into a problem in the garage?" It was Lorenzo. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Yes," Chloe gasped, taking a sharp turn onto the street. "A man, leather jacket, mentioned Carmine. He had a knife." The silence on the line was absolute. Then a single, terrifying question. "Are you hurt, Chloe?" "No, I threw my bag at his face and he slipped on some oil. I drove away." She heard a sharp exhale. It sounded like relief, masked immediately by cold fury. "Drive straight to your apartment," Lorenzo ordered. "Do not stop for gas. Do not stop for a red light if the intersection is clear. Matteo is 3 minutes behind you. He will be sleeping outside your door tonight." "Mr. Rossi, that's not necessary." "Drive, Chloe." The line went dead. Chloe drove. And for the first time in her life, the dark, icy streets of Chicago didn't feel quite so terrifying. The next morning, Chloe opened her apartment door to find Matteo leaning against the hallway wall, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. He looked like he hadn't slept, but his suit was impeccably pressed. "Good morning," he said flatly. "We're not going to the office." He led her to a black SUV parked illegally at the curb. Lorenzo was in the back seat. He didn't look at her as she climbed in, his attention focused on a tablet in his lap. The partition between the driver and the back was up. "Where are we going?" Chloe asked, clutching her replacement tote bag. "My home," Lorenzo said. He finally looked up. His eyes were dark, ringed with a fatigue that went deeper than missed sleep. "Carmine made a mistake last night. He assumed you were just a secretary. He assumed I wouldn't care." "What happened to the man in the garage?" Chloe asked softly. "He had a sudden change of career," Lorenzo replied. The finality in his voice closed the subject permanently. "But Carmine is family. Removing him is complicated. It requires approval from the commission. Until I have it, the office isn't safe for you. You're a target because you're useful to me." "I could just quit," Chloe offered. It was the logical thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. Lorenzo looked at her. Really looked at her. "Would you?" Chloe looked out the tinted window at the passing grey skyline. She thought about the $50 in her bank account. She thought about the electric thrill of solving the ledger puzzles. She thought about the strange, terrifying loyalty these men operated under. "No," she admitted. "I need the health insurance." The corner of Lorenzo's mouth twitched upward. The Rossi estate was an hour outside the city, hidden behind wrought iron gates and acres of dense, snow-covered pines. The house itself was a sprawling modern fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone. It was beautiful, but it felt cold. It felt like a place built for defense, not for living. Inside, the security was invisible but palpable. Men in casual clothes stood at the perimeter of the property, barely visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lorenzo led her to a massive dining room. The table was solid mahogany, long enough to seat 20. He set a stack of boxes on the end of the table. 5 years of backlogged physical receipts from the docks, Lorenzo said. "Carmine ran the docks before he ran the warehouses. I need you to find every penny he stole. I need a paper trail so damning the commission has no choice but to let me put him in the ground." Chloe nodded, taking off her coat. "I'll need highlighters and a calculator with a physical tape." For the next 10 hours, the glass house was silent, except for the furious clicking of the calculator keys and the scratch of Chloe's pen. Lorenzo worked across from her, taking phone calls in hushed, rapid Italian, reading reports, and occasionally just watching her work. At 8 p.m., an older woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense apron emerged from the kitchen carrying a large tray. She set down 2 plates of handmade tortellini, swimming in a rich, dark ragu, and a bottle of Barolo. "Eat, Lorenzo," the woman ordered in heavily accented English. She looked at Chloe. "You too, Piccola. You look like a stiff breeze would snap you." "Thank you, Rosa," Lorenzo said softly. Chloe pushed the ledgers aside. Her back ached and her fingers were cramped. She took a bite of the pasta and closed her eyes. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Oh my God!" Lorenzo poured the wine. He slid a glass toward her. "Rosa has been with my family since I was a boy. She's the only person in the world who tells me what to do." Chloe took a sip of the wine. It tasted like velvet and smoke. The alcohol warmed her chest, loosening the tight knot of anxiety she had carried since the parking garage. "Why do you live out here?" she asked, looking around the massive, empty room. "It's beautiful, but it's isolated." "Isolation is the price of the chair," Lorenzo said. He set his fork down. "When you control everything, everyone wants to control you, or end you. Trust is a liability. Love is a weapon someone else can use against you. So, you build a glass house in the woods and you watch the tree line." He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was stating a fact of his existence, as plainly as she had stated the flaw in his tax routing. "That sounds exhausting," Chloe said honestly. "It is." Lorenzo looked at her over the rim of his wine glass. "You don't belong in this world, Chloe. You drop things. You trip over your own feet. You panic." "I threw a book at a hitman's face," she defended herself defensively. "You did," he agreed, his voice softening. "But you also see the truth. You don't care about the guns or the blood. You look at a ledger and you see the lies people try to hide. In a world full of professional liars, you are entirely transparent. It's a dangerous thing to be." "I'm just doing the math, Mr. Rossi." "Call me Lorenzo," he said quietly. Chloe looked at him. The imposing, terrifying mafia boss was gone. In his place was just a tired man eating dinner in an empty house. "Okay, Lorenzo," she said. She pulled the calculator back toward her. "I found Carmine's offshore account. He's been bleeding you for 3 years. You have your proof." Lorenzo looked at the printed tape. He nodded slowly. "Good. Tomorrow we end this." They left the estate the next afternoon. The sky was the color of dirty lead, threatening snow. Matteo was driving the Bentley. Lorenzo sat in the back with Chloe, the damning file of Carmine's theft resting between them on the leather seat. The plan was simple. A sit-down was scheduled at a neutral restaurant in the city with 2 of the commission elders. Lorenzo would present the file. The elders would nod. Carmine would be dealt with. "Are you nervous?" Lorenzo asked, noticing Chloe gripping her tote bag with white knuckles. "I'm riding in a $500,000 car with the evidence to execute a man," Chloe said, her voice tight. "My normal Tuesday involves organizing paper clips. Yes, Lorenzo, I am deeply, profoundly nervous." "Nothing will happen to you. You are under my protection." They exited the highway, entering the industrial outskirts of the city. The roads were slick with black ice, the abandoned factories casting long, skeletal shadows over the street. Matteo slowed for a red light at an empty intersection. "Don't stop," Lorenzo snapped, a sudden urgency in his voice. His instincts were flaring. The street was too empty. Matteo hit the gas, the heavy Bentley surging forward. It wasn't fast enough. From the alleyway to their right, a heavy steel garbage truck roared out, accelerating blindly. It wasn't an accident. The driver had the pedal pinned to the floor. "Hold on!" Matteo roared, wrenching the steering wheel violently to the left. The Bentley skidded on the ice. The garbage truck slammed into the rear quarter panel of the luxury car. The sound was deafening, the shrieking crunch of tearing metal, shattering glass, and the violent compression of steel. The Bentley spun wildly, jumping the curb and smashing backward into a brick wall. The airbags deployed with a cloud of white powder. For a terrifying, breathless second, there was absolute silence. Chloe's ears were ringing. The world was spinning. She tasted copper. She blinked through the dust, coughing. "Matteo?" Lorenzo's voice was ragged. "I'm good, boss. Pinned, but good." Matteo was struggling against the crushed steering column. He reached under his jacket and pulled his weapon. Chloe turned to Lorenzo. He was slumped against the door. The window beside him was gone, shattered by the impact. "Lorenzo!" she gasped, reaching for him. He groaned, pressing his hand to his left side. Blood, thick and dark, was already seeping through the fingers of his expensive suit. A jagged piece of the doorframe had pierced his side during the crash. "Stay down!" Lorenzo hissed, gripping his own weapon with his right hand. Outside, the doors of the garbage truck opened. Heavy boots hit the pavement. They weren't waiting for the police. Carmine wasn't going to let them make it to the sit-down. Gunfire erupted. The bullets hammered into the reinforced body of the Bentley, sounding like sledgehammers against an anvil. The glass spiderwebbed but held, though the broken window on Lorenzo's side was entirely exposed. "They're flanking!" Matteo shouted, returning fire through a crack in the windshield. "3 shooters. I can't move my leg." Lorenzo tried to shift, raising his gun to the broken window, but a violent cough shook his frame, spraying a mist of blood onto the leather seat. He was losing blood fast. His face was entirely grey. Chloe was paralyzed. The noise was terrifying. It was a physical force pressing against her chest. She had never heard a gunshot in real life. It didn't sound like the movies. It sounded like the end of the world. A shadow moved outside Lorenzo's broken window. A man stepped up, raising a shotgun, aiming directly at Lorenzo's head. Chloe didn't think. There was no time for math. There was no time to panic. She threw herself across the back seat, bodily covering Lorenzo. At the same moment, she grabbed the heavy, thick spine of the physical ledger they had brought, the 5-pound book of Carmine's sins, and shoved it blindly out the broken window directly into the shooter's face. The heavy book slammed into the barrel of the shotgun just as the man pulled the trigger. The blast deflected upward, tearing through the roof of the Bentley, showering the interior with sparks and hot metal. The recoil and the impact of the heavy book threw the shooter off balance. He stumbled backward, slipping on the icy pavement. Matteo didn't miss the opening. 2 suppressed shots rang out from the front seat. The shooter dropped, motionless. Sirens wailed in the distance. The shrill sound of approaching police cruisers cut through the freezing air. Carmine's men were thugs, not martyrs. Hearing the sirens, the remaining shooters scrambled back toward a trailing SUV and sped away, tires squealing. The silence returned, heavy and thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Chloe pushed herself off Lorenzo. She was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. Lorenzo was looking at her. His eyes were wide, shocked. He looked at the shattered roof, then down at the blood pooling on the seat, then at the girl who couldn't walk across a room without tripping. She had just thrown herself between him and a shotgun. "Chloe," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He squeezed his eyes shut, his head falling back against the headrest. "You're bleeding." She touched her cheek. A piece of shrapnel had grazed her face. Her fingers came away red, but she barely felt it. She looked down at Lorenzo's side. The blood flow was increasing. "You're bleeding more," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, hyper-focused monotone. The panic was gone, replaced by the sheer mechanical need to fix a problem. She ripped off her scarf. She unbuttoned Lorenzo's ruined jacket and pressed the thick wool directly into the gaping wound in his side. Lorenzo cried out, a raw sound of agony, his hand shooting up to grip her wrist. His grip was bruising. "Keep the pressure," Matteo grunted from the front, frantically working his leg free. "Ambulance is 3 minutes out. Hold it, Chloe." "I've got it," she said. She climbed over the center console, straddling Lorenzo's legs to put her entire body weight onto her hands, pressing the scarf deep into the wound. Lorenzo looked up at her. His vision was blurring, the edges of the world turning dark. But the center of his focus was perfectly clear. It was Chloe. Her cheap glasses were cracked. Her hair was wild. Her face was smeared with her own blood and his. "You saved my life." "With a math book," Lorenzo whispered, a bloody, incredulous smile touching his pale lips. "It was an accounting ledger," Chloe corrected him, her tears finally spilling over, mixing with the dirt on her face. "Now shut up and don't die. You owe me a new pair of boots." Lorenzo's hand slid from her wrist, moving up to rest weakly against her uninjured cheek. His thumb brushed a tear away, leaving a smear of red. "Anything you want, Piccola," he murmured, before his eyes rolled back and he slipped into the dark. Chloe pressed harder, the sirens screaming outside, knowing that when he woke up, nothing would ever be the same. The private clinic did not smell like bleach, but it possessed a chemical sterility that coated the back of Chloe's throat. It was tucked beneath a legitimate cosmetic surgery center in the Gold Coast, funded entirely by cash that didn't exist on any government ledger. She sat in a hard plastic chair, staring at the scuffed toe of her left boot. She had been staring at it for 6 hours. The blood on her hands had dried, turning into a stiff, rust-colored crust that flaked when she curled her fingers. A nurse had tried to take her to a washroom. Chloe had simply shaken her head, locking her jaw. She wouldn't leave the hallway. She wouldn't let them move her away from the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. Matteo limped out of that door around midnight. His left leg was encased in a temporary brace, and his suit jacket was gone, revealing a shoulder holster over a blood-spattered white shirt. He looked hollowed out. He walked over to Chloe and sank heavily into the chair beside her. He didn't speak. He pulled a crushed pack of cigarettes from his pocket, stared at it for a long moment, and then shoved it back. "The surgeon says the jagged edge missed his kidney by less than a centimeter," Matteo finally rasped. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual abrasive edge. "He lost 4 pints. He flatlined on the table for 20 seconds before they got the heart pumping again." Chloe stopped looking at her boot. She turned her head slowly. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, a low, maddening frequency. "Is he alive?" "He's breathing." Matteo turned to look at her. He took in the dried blood on her face, the cracked lens of her glasses, and the ruined, bloody state of her oversized blazer. The sneer he usually reserved for civilians was entirely gone. In its place was something that looked dangerously close to reverence. "You didn't run. I was trapped in the back seat. The door beside you was blown open by the crash. You could have crawled out. You covered him instead." Matteo leaned his elbows on his knees, staring at the linoleum floor. "I've seen made men who took oaths in blood, run away when the shotguns came out. You threw a book at a hitter." "It was a very heavy book," Chloe said quietly. The adrenaline had long since metabolized, leaving behind a cold, crushing exhaustion. Her bones ached. Her ribs felt bruised from the seatbelt. "You're a terrifying woman, Chloe." A doctor emerged from the metal door. He wore green scrubs and a look of profound fatigue. He nodded at Matteo. "He's awake. The anesthesia is wearing off. He's agitated. He keeps pulling at the IV lines. We can't sedate him further without risking his pressure dropping again." Matteo stood, groaning as weight hit his bad leg. He looked down at Chloe. "Go in. He won't listen to me." Chloe stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She walked down the short hallway and pushed open the heavy door. The room was dim, illuminated only by the rhythmic pulse of the telemetry monitors. Lorenzo lay in the center of a narrow hospital bed. His chest was wrapped in thick, white bandages. The skin of his face matched the sheets, a startling, bloodless grey. He was fighting a nurse with his right arm, trying to tear a piece of tape off the back of his hand. "Mr. Rossi," the nurse pleaded, stepping back as he swiped blindly at her. "You need the fluids." "Get out," Lorenzo snarled. The voice lacked its usual booming authority, reduced to a gravelly, laboured hiss, but the venom was intact. The nurse looked at Chloe, desperate. Chloe nodded toward the door. The nurse practically ran out of the room. Chloe walked to the edge of the bed. Lorenzo's eyes darted toward her. His pupils were blown wide from the painkillers, black pools in the dim light. His breathing hitched, a sharp, painful intake of air that made the monitors spike. He dropped his arm to the bed. The fight instantly drained out of him. "You're covered in my blood," he whispered. "It washes off," Chloe replied. She stood by the metal rail, not entirely sure what to do with her hands. She finally settled for gripping the cold steel bar. Lorenzo turned his head toward her. The sheer vulnerability in his expression was jarring. This wasn't the man who ordered hits. This wasn't the boss who terrified grown men with a single look. This was a man who had nearly died on a leather seat, saved by a girl making $15 an hour. "Did they get Carmine?" he asked. The question was a physical effort. "Matteo is handling it," Chloe lied. She didn't know what Matteo was doing, but she knew Lorenzo needed to hear that the problem was contained. Lorenzo closed his eyes. "I remember the crash. I remember the cold." He opened his eyes, pinning her with a gaze that saw straight through the cracked lenses of her glasses. "And I remember you. You jumped on me. It seemed like the logical thing to do. You sign my paychecks." A weak, breathy laugh escaped him, turning immediately into a grimace of pain. He clenched his jaw, waiting for the agony to pass. When it did, he reached his right hand slowly across the sheets. Chloe hesitated, then uncurled her fingers from the bed rail and let him take her hand. His skin was freezing. His grip was weak, but the intent was absolute. "I've spent my entire life building walls," Lorenzo murmured, his thumb weakly stroking the dried blood on her knuckles. "Iron, concrete, money, men with guns. I thought that was safety. And then a garbage truck hits my car, and the only thing standing between me and a casket is a girl with a pink pen." He pulled her hand slightly closer. "You shouldn't have risked your life for me, Chloe. I'm a monster to most of the city." "You're not a monster," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "A monster wouldn't have laughed when I spilled coffee on Matteo. A monster wouldn't have asked if I was okay before asking about his money." She leaned down, closing the distance between them. She wasn't trembling anymore. "You run a brutal business, but you're just a man. And right now, you are a very broken man who needs to go to sleep." Lorenzo stared at her. The heavy narcotic pull of the painkillers was dragging him under, but he fought it just to keep looking at her face. "Don't leave the clinic," he ordered, his voice fading. It wasn't a boss giving a command, it was a desperate plea. "I'm not going anywhere, Lorenzo," she promised. He finally closed his eyes. Within seconds, the rigid lines of pain in his face softened. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor settled into a steady, slow lullaby. Chloe stood there in the dim room, holding the hand of the most dangerous man in Chicago, and realized with terrifying clarity that she was absolutely, irrevocably bound to him. It took 3 weeks for Lorenzo to stand upright without heavily relying on a cane. He forced himself to walk unassisted 2 days before the sit-down. The meeting was not held in a neutral restaurant. Lorenzo dictated the terms. He chose an abandoned meatpacking warehouse on the south side. It was a cold, cavernous space that smelled of old rust and ammonia. It was a place designed for slaughter, and the symbolism was entirely intentional. Chloe stood in the shadows near the back wall, wrapped in a thick wool coat. The temperature inside the building was hovering near freezing. She held a locked briefcase. Inside it was not cash, but 72 pages of meticulously cross-referenced bank statements, shipping logs, and offshore wire transfers. The elders arrived in 2 black sedans. There were 3 of them. Frail-looking men in heavy overcoats, their faces mapped with decades of violence and survival. They sat at a folding metal table placed in the center of the vast concrete floor. Lorenzo sat opposite them. He wore a dark suit tailored to hide the bulk of the bandages still wrapped tightly around his torso. Matteo stood behind him, leaning slightly on his good leg. 10 minutes later, Carmine was brought in. He didn't walk in under his own power. 2 of Lorenzo's men dragged him through the heavy sliding doors and dumped him onto the concrete. Carmine looked terrible. His face was bruised, his clothes torn. He had been intercepted trying to board a private charter at Midway 3 nights after the crash. Carmine scrambled to his knees, his eyes darting frantically between Lorenzo and the elders. "Dominic," Carmine gasped, looking at the oldest of the 3 elders. "This is a setup. He's paranoid. He's consolidating power and eliminating his own blood to do it." Dominic, an 80-year-old man with eyes like chipped flint, didn't look at Carmine. He looked at Lorenzo. "You called this sit-down, Lorenzo. You claimed theft and an unsanctioned hit. These are heavy accusations against a cousin." "I don't make accusations," Lorenzo said. His voice echoed in the empty warehouse, cold and sharp as a butcher's knife. "I provide facts." Lorenzo didn't move his head, but he raised his left hand slightly. From the shadows, Chloe stepped forward. The heavy thud of her steel-toed boots echoed off the concrete. She walked into the dim circle of light cast by a single overhead industrial bulb. She didn't look at the elders, and she absolutely refused to look at Carmine. She walked directly to Lorenzo's side, set the briefcase on the metal table, unlocked it with a sharp click, and pulled out 3 thick binders. She placed one in front of each elder. "What is this?" Dominic asked, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "Who is the girl?" "She's the keeper of my books," Lorenzo said. "Open them." Dominic opened the binder. The other 2 followed. Chloe stood tall. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her breathing slow and steady. She had rehearsed this. She knew the math. "Page 4, Chloe spoke into the silence. Her voice was clear, ringing out over the hum of a distant generator. "You will see a shell corporation registered in Panama. The routing numbers correspond to the freight manifests from the West Side docks, overseen by Carmine Rossi. By inflating the gross tonnage of incoming shipments, he extracted a surplus margin of 12% per container." Carmine sneered from the floor. "She's a secretary. You're taking the word of a nobody over your own blood." "Turn to page 22, Chloe continued, her voice hardening. She ignored Carmine entirely. The diverted funds were pooled and wired to an offshore account in the Caymans. The account is held under a proxy, but if you look at page 25, you'll see the property tax payments for a villa in Boca Raton. The deed for that villa is in the name of Carmine's wife. The silence that followed was absolute. The elders were not modern men. They barely understood computers, but they understood real estate, and they understood greed. The math was flawless. The paper trail was undeniable. Chloe had built a cage of numbers so tight there was no room for Carmine to breathe. Dominic closed the binder. He placed his frail, liver-spotted hands on top of the black leather. He finally looked down at Carmine. The old man's face held no anger, only a chilling bureaucratic finality. $3 million, Dominic stated. He's lying. She forged it, Carmine screamed, trying to stand. Matteo took one step forward and kicked Carmine in the chest, dropping him back to the concrete. The hit on the street, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave. It was sloppy. It exposed the family to the feds, and it nearly cost me my life. The theft I could have handled internally. The ambush requires a public resolution. Dominic nodded slowly. He looked at Lorenzo. The commission agrees. The theft is proven. The unsanctioned violence is an insult to the table. He is yours, Lorenzo. Do it quickly. The elders stood up. They didn't say another word. They walked back to their cars and drove away, leaving Carmine thrashing on the floor. Lorenzo stood up. The movement was stiff, betraying the pain he was still in. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, suppressed pistol. Lorenzo, Carmine begged, blood leaking from his lip. Please, blood, we're blood. You spilled our blood first, Lorenzo said. He didn't hand the gun to Matteo. A boss handled his own house cleaning. But before he raised the weapon, Lorenzo turned to Chloe. Go to the car, he said softly. Chloe looked at him. She looked at the gun. She didn't want to see this. She didn't want this violence in her head. But she understood that this was the brutal reality of the man she had saved. She nodded once, picked up the empty briefcase, and turned her back. She walked toward the heavy sliding doors. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. On step 8, a single muffled thwip echoed behind her, followed by the heavy, sickening sound of dead weight hitting the concrete floor. Chloe didn't flinch. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the freezing Chicago air. She stood by the Bentley, staring up at the grey sky, and took a long, deep breath. The books were balanced. The ledger was closed. Spring came to Chicago late, dragging its feet through weeks of sleet and bitter winds. By May, the ice had finally melted off Lake Michigan, and the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 40th floor offered a view of a city trying to come alive. The Rossi Corporation was running smoother than it had in a decade. Fear was no longer the sole motivator. It had been replaced by a terrifying, absolute efficiency. Chloe sat behind a new desk. It wasn't outside Lorenzo's office anymore. It was inside his office, situated opposite his massive obsidian slab. She no longer wore thrift store blazers. She wore tailored wool trousers and silk blouses, though she stubbornly retained her steel-toed boots. They had become a matter of principle. It was Friday evening. The office was empty. The city lights were beginning to flicker on against the twilight. Chloe was staring at a laptop screen, rubbing her temples. You're squinting, Lorenzo noted from his side of the room. He was reviewing a contract, a glass of amber bourbon resting near his elbow. He moved flawlessly now, the physical scars hidden beneath expensive cotton, though the psychological shift remained. He was quieter, more deliberate. The new shell company in Nevada is too clean, Chloe said, turning her laptop slightly toward him. It looks artificial. We need to introduce a margin of error, a delayed filing, a minor penalty payment. Legitimate businesses make mistakes. Perfect ledgers look like laundering. Lorenzo set his pen down. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching her. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the woman behind it. Introduce a late fee, he said. Make it look negligent. Done, she replied, her fingers flying across the keys. She hit enter and closed the laptop. She sighed, stretching her arms over her head. That's the end of the first quarter reconciliation. Everything is clean. Everything is walled off. Lorenzo stood up. He walked around his desk, bypassing the chair he usually took, and leaned his hip against the edge of her desk. He picked up the bright pink gel pen she still insisted on using and turned it slowly between his fingers. Matteo is taking over the physical operations on the docks, Lorenzo said quietly. I'm stepping back from the street-level disputes. The commission approved the restructure. Chloe looked up at him. Why? Because being on the street puts a target on my back. Lorenzo looked down at her. His dark eyes were intense, stripping away the distance they usually maintained during business hours. And a target on my back means a target on anyone standing near me. Chloe's breath caught slightly in her throat. She understood what he was saying without him actually saying it. The restructure wasn't for business. It was for her. I threw a book at a man with a shotgun, she reminded him softly, an attempt at deflection. I can handle a target. I know you can, Lorenzo murmured. He dropped the pink pen onto the desk. He reached out, his large, scarred hands gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed the delicate skin beneath her cheekbones. But you shouldn't have to. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The massive, intimidating boss of the Chicago syndicate was standing in front of her, yielding entirely. When you jumped across that car seat, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a rough, quiet register. You didn't just save my life, Chloe. You ruined me for anything else. I look at this empire, I look at the money, and it means absolutely nothing if you aren't sitting across from me. Chloe swallowed hard. The cynicism she had carried for years, the armor she wore to survive a world that usually crushed people like her, cracked down the middle. I'm clumsy, she whispered, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. I break things. I talk back when I shouldn't. I'm a terrible mafia asset. A slow, devastating smile broke across Lorenzo's face. It reached his eyes, warming the dark flint into something entirely human. You're exactly what I need, he said. He leaned down, and the kiss wasn't a sudden, chaotic collision. It was deliberate. It was heavy, grounded, and intensely possessive. Chloe closed her eyes, the last of her defenses crumbling as his hands slid from her cheeks to tangle in her hair. Pulling her up from the chair, she met him halfway, her hands gripping the lapels of his tailored suit, anchoring herself to him. In a world built on blood, deception, and shifting loyalties, this was the only thing that felt completely, undeniably real. They finally pulled apart, both breathing slightly heavier. Lorenzo rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. No more secrets in the ledgers, he whispered against her lips. No more late-night ambushes, she countered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his chest. Lorenzo chuckled, a low, warm sound. He kissed her forehead and stepped back, offering her his hand. Come on, he said, pulling her gently toward the door. Rosa made tortellini, and you owe me a new rug for the break room. Chloe laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the cavernous office. She grabbed her heavy canvas tote bag, slipped her hand into his, and walked out to the elevator. She tripped slightly over the threshold, her boot catching the metal track. Lorenzo caught her effortlessly, not breaking stride. He didn't even look down. He just tightened his grip on her hand and led her into the elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut on the city below, securing them entirely in a world they had built for themselves. That wraps up the gritty, high-stakes story of Chloe and Lorenzo. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a criminal empire isn't a gun. It's a brilliant mind with a pink gel pen. If this grounded take on the mafia romance trope kept you hooked until the very last page, make sure to smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a capable, fiercely smart underdog. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Chloe outsmarting the syndicate? See you in the next story.